Welcome back to the Master's Blueprints. In this second series, we will be discussing what is going to be chapter 2 of the book, which is the action potentials of growth. Now, we will be building upon what we learned on in chapter 1, which is about the stages of the heart in the parable of the sower, which, as we covered, was the hardened ground, the shallow ground, the weeded ground, and the fruitful ground. And these are degrees in which we can be receptive or not to the things that God has for us. So the things in His Word, His promises, hearing His voice, the degree of humility we bring to the Word is reflected in the parable of the sower of the condition of our heart being able to receive it. And based on the prepared condition of the heart, whether it's hardened, shallow, weeded, or fruitful, we will have different degrees of growth. So if you have not yet listened to the first series, I'm going to link here the video. I want you to go back and listen through series 1 because we're building on principles from the first series. So while you can continue in this video, if you've not watched that first series, you're not going to get quite as much out of this if you don't first have that. So if you haven't done so, click over to that link, take a look at that one. But if you're ready to move on, let's take a look at what we're talking about with the extra levels. So as I began seeking this out further, as I began studying it, as I began praying over it, what I began to start asking the Lord is what are the levels or what are the places we need to actually make these changes? Because if we're following the logic, and again, we're talking about a logical system in a way where we can be thoughtful, reflective, and intelligent, where we have a say in what happens. So if we're following that logic, then what we need to then follow that up with, is if I have a choice, if there is a way for me to intelligently decide how to prepare and position my heart to receive from God, then that should mean there are certain types of choices I can make in order to work with the system. There should be choices I can make and do so in a thoughtful and reflective manner so that I can begin to move through these stages. Again, we're following the logic of I have a choice, I'm able to think about this, and so therefore we need to ask the question, what are those choices? What are those things that we can be doing to progress through those stages of growth? And these are the kinds of questions I was reflecting on and meditating on, asking the Lord to help broaden my perspective. And so I began looking at it this way. And you're probably wondering, why do we have this chart here? Well, if we say that this is a axis of growth, so let's back up to our one. We have a unreceptive to a receptive axis. Well, if you're looking at an axis, then that means it's a scale of some kind. And what stuck out to me is that we have fruitful, and we talk about 30, 60, 100 fold. Those are degrees within an axis. And so the question would be, well, if this is an axis, then there has to be some kind of 0 to 100, because we actually do have our 100. 30, 60, 100 fold. 100 fold would be the maximum level of growth, the maximum possible potential. And so then if we say it's a scale and fruitful, weeded, shallow, and hardened are lesser degrees, well, then 0 would be completely unreached. So now we have the parable of the sower, but we're looking at it as a scale. But then the question is, like we said, what are the degrees between each of these sections? I'm going to see if I can get my mouse on here. We're still learning how to do some fancier stuff on these recordings here. So the question, again, that we're asking is, what are the degrees of growth? So we're looking at, you can probably see my mouse here, what are these degrees here? We need to ask, what is this going to look like? there has to be some kind of measurable difference between fruitful and 100, between weeded and fruitful, between shallow and weeded. Each of them has a measurement. Now, obviously, only some of what we're looking at is quantitative, 30, 60, 100-fold. We're not going to be pulling out numbers and those somehow mean something mystical or magical. We don't need to look at the Bible that way, but I think the logic we can still follow here. So, first, though, before I get into that, we're doing a lot of establishing groundwork. I want to talk about why are we calling these action potentials, like we said. And so what we want to look at here is we have in our body, we have neurons that are throughout our entire body. We'll put our definition here. Let's read it. Neurons are cells that transfer information in the brain by using electrical impulses to send chemical signals to both surrounding brain cells and to the body's nervous system. There are these structures in here, and you can see the chart here. You've got the axon, you have the myelin sheaths, the synapses, the dendrites. I'm not going to go doing a full neurology explanation at this point. If you want to dive deeper into that, you're more than welcome to. The key thing I want you to get out of this element is when you're considering things, when you're thinking about things, the way that information propagates in your body, whether it's something as simple as I got burned and your body's communicating that we are injured, we are hurt, and that shoots up your arm and then you pull away. That's achieved via communication in these neural pathways. And the method by which your body performs these communications are what's called an action potential. And so this process of the neurons sending the signals is achieved via this action potential. Now, what this action potential is that you have within the body, as we saw, you've got these different elements that are within this complex system here. So you've got the central cell body that is originating some kind of signal like pain. And then it's got to send the signal up through the synapses to eventually get to the brain, and then your brain decides, oh, we are in danger, we need to get away. It sends a signal back, it sends it back through this kind of pathway back to the point of origin, and it tells your muscles, move, pull away. It's doing this via electrical signals. And the mechanism by which it does that is that it builds up various polarized and depolarized fluctuations. That is what the action potential is. The action potential is where you have different chemicals such as sodium, potassium, and chloride. Sodium, potassium being positively charged, chloride being negatively charged. And then your body, when it receives certain stimulus, the way it translates the stimulus is by fluctuating by polarizing and depolarizing the cells in these neurons, and different things like the myelin sheaths help expedite this communication so that it can jump past each sheath in a rapid way. That's why your body can react in such a rapid process, is because of the way that these chemicals, these ionic charges, the way that these cells are structured, it enables immensely fast communication. But why are we talking about this? The key thing about how this action potential is achieved is that your body is manually adjusting concentrations of these ions. And the concentrations of these ions are what produce, when they reach a certain threshold, it produces a signal, it produces a communication, and therefore then produces a movement or a response. And so the reason we're calling this action potentials is because the first layer of the parable of the sower is what we were talking about, is the receptivity of the heart to be able to receive something. But once it receives something, it demands a response. The fruitfulness or weededness, the different responses that occur are based on things that we decide after we have prepared ourselves. So the first level of the parable of the sower is we've established ourselves in a position for reception, but then after we have established what degree we're going to be receptive to the word of God, once we do receive something, just like your body reacts, you have different ways you can react to the word. And based on the ways you decide to react, it's going to progress you through different degrees of growth. So it's a combination of both how you've positioned yourself to be ready for the word and the responses that you begin to learn and adapt to be able to progress through degrees of growth. And so the scripture gives us this. It's right in the middle of the parable, actually, hidden right in plain sight. It says, Matthew 13:15, "For this people's heart has grown dull, and with their ears they can barely hear, and with their eyes they have closed, lest," we're talking retroactively now about a person who has growth, "they should see with their eyes, hear with their ears, understand with their heart, and turn, and I would heal them." So right there, you've got see, hear, understand, turn, and healing. And what were we looking for? Things within the 5 divisions between 0 and 100, between our 4 lines on this chart. Seeing is the division between unreceptive and hardened. If you don't see something, you can't even respond to it. You don't even have the opportunity to reject something if you don't perceive it. But once you perceive it, you could choose to stop at hardened and reject it. Your heart is not ready. So you've seen, you've rejected. Your journey is over. You could continue to progress, though. You could decide after you hear it, instead of being hardened, you go further and you hear it, which means you begin to receive it and process it. We're going to go through what each of these mean and why these also fit in these divisions, but this is how we're looking at it. So I want you to have this understanding as we progress, is that seeing, hearing, understanding, turning, and healing are the dividing action potentials between these stages of the heart. Just like in action potential, there's a buildup of sodium and potassium and chloride, and there's these different ratios of ionic charges. When the right ratio occurs, you are able to move information and move and progress. These are the action potentials of growth between these various stages. So let's take a further look in them. Seeing. So this is the action potential between the unreached to the hardened ground. It means to go from completely unreached to having perceived it. That is the action potential between 0 and hardened. You can't even reject something if you have not even perceived it in the first place. You have to be able to have an option to be able to even respond to the information. You can't be hardened towards something that you don't perceive, that you don't hear, that you don't have any knowledge whatsoever of. I can't reject something that has not been presented to me. So if the opportunity to see something occurs, then you are on the first stage, the first action potential towards responding to what God has to say. Now, once you have done that, then you can choose to reject it or not. And if you choose to reject it because your heart is not prepared to receive what you've seen, like we said, then this is where we stop. And seeing is all that occurs. But if our heart is ready and we're ready to hear something, well, we still perceive it. It's not like we skip seeing and we skip through any of these steps. All of these steps happen if you are prepared and ready. So the next step is, okay, I perceived something. Now I'm going to actually hear it. Now, these, for the most part, a lot of times the Bible talks about seeing and hearing. It's because they happen so close together that it almost feels like a singular step most of the time in terms of actual experience. We see and hear something almost kind of live in real time, just like you're listening to me. If you're listening to me, you're simultaneously perceiving me, my voice, what I'm presenting to you, the concepts I'm giving to you. And if you have not found me to be disagreeable in some way, then you choose to not just see me and just have me in the background, but now you're hearing because you've made an instantaneous decision to go beyond perception into receiving what I have to present to you. That happens for everything that we experience. So hearing allows the shallow sprout to come up. If you hear it and you're just like, I think I can understand that. I think there's something there to that. If we do that, we progress from just hardened to shallow. So we see, we hear, but if we stop there and we're like, oh, that sounds like a good idea, and then just leave it at that, then we remain at shallow and we don't activate the next action potential, which is understanding. So now once you've heard something and if you're holding on to it and you're like, what they said or what I read or what I heard God say, it's really got me thinking now. Now you're progressing past hearing into understanding. So you begin to apply energy to meditate on it, to go past just shallowness towards taking root. It's not yet as maximum potential, and there may be obstacles in the way. But again, if we're stopping here, we're starting to try to understand. You hear your pastor preach a message and you're starting to be like, what he said really got to me. It really really referred to this situation I've been going through. You're starting to think about it. You're starting to incorporate the ideas that you heard and saw into, well, what does that actually look like for me? How can I apply that to my life? But again, if we stop there, that's why we're ended up at the weeded zone, because what is weeded? If a person is weeded and they're not ready to make changes, but they're still understanding it, they're still thinking about it, but they've not made additional room to be able to progress further. That's why we stop at weeded, and that's where understanding gets us from shallow to weeded. So what if we keep trying? What if we're even more receptive? What does the next step look like after we've understood it? Turn. You begin to hear what you've heard. You take what you've seen, you've heard, and you've begun to understand. And then you begin to realize, oh, if I'm going to actually apply this to my life, I need to start making some changes. I need to be pruned. I need to care or tend or remove these weeds from my life in order to be able to actually make these changes. If you're going to go from being weeded to fruitful, you have to remove the weeds. And the way you remove the weeds is you see, hear, understand, and then you start to make some decisions, to make some changes in your life to actually be able to apply what you've seen, heard, and understand. You see how this is a progression where if we want to become fruitful, it requires, like we said, both being receptive and making some intentional choices and changes. So that's why we're calling these the action potentials, because if you don't have this appropriate ratio of these things are not present. If you don't have both the combination of being receptive and the combination of being able to start making some willful changes, you're not going to have the right things in the right ratio to be able to progress towards growth. All right, so what's the last one? Because even though we're starting to think about ways to change our ways, we're thinking about ways to turn, there's still 30, 60, and 100-fold. That means there's the degrees of growth that can only be accomplished once we have allowed God to heal us of broken places. getting into actual maturity and freedom means that we don't just see, we don't just hear, we don't just think about it a little bit, and we even don't just simply start saying, I'm going to make a few changes and that's going to be that. The real root cause at the end of the day to be able to grow the full fruits of the Spirit is we eventually get down to the level where we say, man, I not only need to change my ways, there's something about the way that I've approached this my entire life that's just fundamentally broken. Or it can even come up, like we said, things have happened to you. You've had traumas, you've had issues, you've had problems, you've had difficult family members, you've had disabilities. I've lived with disabilities my whole life. My son has a disability. It's difficult and challenging. And it's really tough to be able to listen to a message about how God has blessed us and we're still dealing with things. But at the very end of the day, if I'm going to be fruitful despite that situation, the only way I'm going to do that is if I eventually realize that, God, I need to reckon with myself and my brokenness, my displaced expectations. Because what does Proverbs say is that it is hope deferred makes the heart sick. So it's not that God is ignoring me. It's not that God is not blessed me. It's that I have a hope that needs to be healed. I have deferred hopes and a sickness in my heart that I need to heal. And if I'm going to be fruitful despite my circumstances, not that God can't turn those circumstances around, but really what matters at the end of the day is not the fact that God has healed me. It's the fact that how do I feel about God in the first place, and do I want to spend eternity with him? I'm not going to be fruitful in my life if I can't have that attitude regardless of my circumstances. If I can't take joy in every situation, as the Bible calls it, I'm going to be limited in my fruitfulness. I'm going to be remaining in that weeded or lower end of the fruitful range. So healing is that final stage to get us from 30, 60 to 100 fold. Because as we begin to work through each of these things, okay, God, let's say I'm going to be fruitful. I want to be fruitful no matter how I feel. I've got to see and hear. I got to understand. I have to turn, but then I have to allow God to actually make changes. I have to actually allow God to speak to those broken places, to heal me of the things that are truly hindering me, which is not really the circumstances, although they are an important factor. It still is valid to talk about the feelings and the issues that are presented in your circumstances. That is valid, but it really is in the end, and if we're talking about eternal growth, if we're talking about eternal development into maturity in a way that where we can be the kind of people that can work with God's promises in eternity, if we can't find joy and healing in these circumstances now, how much more will we not be able to when things get even more challenging over years and years of eternity? There's going to be even bigger things that God wants to do eventually in our lives and through us. But if we can't even trust him for the littlest of things, that $20 that we need to the end of the week, then God can't give us even bigger things to have faith for. And so, again, as we go through this series, we're going to go through next what are the choices that progress us through those stages, which we will get into this next couple of videos. The next 4 or a couple more videos, depending on how many we need to do, we're going to go in depth into what are the actual changes we're also going to make to progress through these stages. Because again, I want you to see that the parable of the sower is more than just simply stages we can be in. We uncovered a lot in the first series about how there's more to it than just you're one type of person. There's more to just defining people in a black and white box scenario where you're one of 4 type of people. This is a roadmap to help you begin to actually make changes, to actually receive from God, but then actually be able to do something no matter what your circumstances are. So I appreciate you for sticking with this video and with this series. We will continue to go more in depth with these stages as we go along in this series. So stay tuned, and thank you for joining.